to you from Cape Canaveral on the launch of Apollo 11. A shuttle is about to take off with Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin in it. He is planning to walk on the moon. Government officials believe this will become a major chapter in the space race going on between the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
After the launch of Sputnik 1 on October 1, 1957, the U.S. was determined to prove their technological superiority to the USSR. The launch of Sputnik 1 led to the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Act in July 1958 and created NASA on October 1, 1958. Sputnik 2 was launched by the USSR on November 3, 1957, carrying a live dog named Laika.
The U.S. launched Explorer 1, the first American satellite to reach orbit, and that also discovered the Van Allen radiation belt on January 31, 1958. Then, on March 5, 1958, Explorer 2 was launched. It failed to reach orbit, unfortunately. March 17, 1958, Vanguard 1 satellite was launched into orbit. Even though communication was lost in 1964, it remains the oldest human-made satellite in orbit. On October 11, 1958, Pioneer 1 became the first spacecraft launched by NASA.
The space race is a race for the Soviets to prove to the U.S. and vice versa that they are more technologically advanced, including advanced in the creation of weapons. This started when President Eisenhower proposed the Open Skies policy, stating that either nation would be allowed to fly reconnaissance aircraft over the other, and the Soviets refused.
April 1, 1960, TIROS-1 became the first successful weather satellite by the U.S. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel through space, making a 108-minute orbit in Vostok 1. Less than 1 month later, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. In that same May of 1961, President Kennedy addressed Congress and challenged the nation to go to the moon before the end of this decade. In the meantime of the discussion of the moon program, in that July, Gus Grissom was launched on a suborbital flight. His Liberty Bell capsule had been filled with water, sank down, and was lost after splashdown. A month later, the USSR struck back. German Tito spent a day in space aboard the Vostok 2.
Early in the December of the same year, NASA announced the Gemini program. In February of 1962, the impressive John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times. Scott Carpenter repeated Glenn's flight 3 months later aboard the Aurora 7. In September of that year, NASA was selected its second group of astronauts. Another man, Walter Schirra, orbited the Earth again in October of 1962. Schirra orbited 6 times around the Earth.
On May 15, 1963, the brave Gordon Cooper spent 34 whole hours in space alone. A month later, Soviet Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman to ever go into space. A very, very sad day ensued a few months later. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated.
On July 31, 1964, Ranger 7 transmitted the first pictures of the moon. Ranger 7 was the first successful American aircraft. It approached the moon on target and transmitted 4,316 images before it impacted the lunar surface on the northern rim of the Sea of Clouds. Then, on March 18, 1965, Soviet Alexei Leonov performed the first spacewalk, spending 12 minutes outside the Vostochny spacecraft. February 3, 1966, the Soviets launched Luna 9, the first spacecraft to land on the moon, which proved that the lunar surface could support the weight of a lander. And on April 3rd, Luna 10 became the first satellite to orbit the moon.
The U.S. fired back on August 14, 1966. Lunar Orbiter 1 orbited the moon and took the first pictures of Earth. On October 18, 1967, Venera 4 transmitted data about the atmosphere of Venus back to Earth. A couple of months later, the Soviets suffered a great loss when Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, died in a plane crash on March 27, 1968.
On September 15, 1968, Soviet Zond 5 was launched. It was the first spacecraft to orbit the moon and return. Apollo 7 was launched on October 11, 1968. It was the first staffed Apollo mission with Walter Schirra, Don Ellis, and Walter Cunningham, and it orbited Earth once. Apollo 8 was launched on December 21, 1968. The spacecraft carried Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. It was the first Apollo to use the Saturn V rocket.
The Soviets launched Soyuz 4 on January 14, 1969, and Soyuz 5 on January 15, 1969. It was the first successful Soviet spaceship docking. Many attempts have been made before but failed.
We'll be back after these messages.
This is a typical meal served to astronauts aboard Apollo space flights. Oatmeal, sausage, toast, applesauce, and in a special zero-gravity pouch, Tang, the energy breakfast drink. Tang, with rich natural flavor and more vitamin C than orange juice. But Tang's biggest role isn't in NASA's space program. It's right here on Earth.
Here's a video of President Kennedy's address to Congress.
William Bradford, speaking in 1630 of the founding of the Plymouth Bay Colony, said that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulty, and both must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courage. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead. Whether we join in it or not, we mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond. Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men. There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon.
Here's a live stream video of the launch of Apollo 11.
Here's a live stream video of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon.
11:07, 2 afternoon,